All right, guys, thank you for joining. We're recording now, and this is going to be posted. I'll post it myself as well as Navionics. So if anybody you know that couldn't make this, or if you wanted to go back and look this back over again, you're more than welcome to. But we'll move forward here. This is the biology and fish movements of Blueback Herring lakes. You're going to see a lot of Lake Murray influence on this. This is where my home lake is. It's also where the Forestwood Cup is coming, so this is good timing. So we're going to move forward here, and we will have a question and answer time here at the end. So if there's something I did not touch base on, or you would like to know additionally, you can have time to ask at the end, or feel free to drop me an email or a Facebook message. Anyway, we'll move forward here. A little bit about myself. If you haven't seen any of my my webinars in the past, I do have a fisheries degree. I am a certified fisheries biologist. I'm one of the few that have fished professionally. The late Ken Cook, tribute to him. You have Stacy King, Jim Moynihan, myself. There might be a few others, but those are the few that I know that have been very influential in the industry. My specialty, everybody has a specialty. My specialty is freshwater. Specifically anything to do with water quality and aquaculture. Much of that is runoff and pollution is what I've studied. Also food diet research, what fish eat. Much of my research was done on more assisting graduate students with maintaining their environments. Much of those are endangered fish. With that, they have to be hatched. So a lot of time is feeding them all the way from an egg to the end result of what the study is going to be. I did do a year-long crayfish study in college on an artificial wetlands. And again, I studied mostly at an internship in college where I studied thermal pollution monitoring with runoff coal burning facilities. So that's much of my background. If you guys also have any questions on that, in the past, some of my webinars I did on crayfish, but feel free to also drop me a line. I am a professional angler, lure designer, and a guide on Lake Murray. I do design currently for Rains and IMA and Optimum. Some of my designs in the past have been for Spro and a couple various companies. All right, the Blueback Herring. This is a fun subject. You know, it's a subject that still many people don't know about. You have a lot of fun. The Blueback Herring itself does have good and bad. A lot of people see the good into it, but think that it's just an unlimited resource of good. There is some bad, and there is things that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services do to maintain that in the state DNR. That'll help communicate as to why they do some of the things they do. I do understand, but as a whole, it's been very positive. It's we'll move forward here. We'll show that this is an artist drawing of it. In case you don't get as good a look on the next picture, but this is what it looks like in the wild here. I'm going to do something. I'm going to try this. I want to point out something real quick here. Looking at this picture, you'll see the blue here, and you'll see the blue back here. The thing about that is the blue will typically have, there's an iridescent finish over the minnow. So when you're looking at colors, a lot of people think they're just a solid blue or purple on the back. But realistically, they're more of a green or olive color with like a glimmer blue finish. They start to turn that real dark purpley blue when they start to die. A lot of people don't know that, but when you see them in their natural environment, in the water, here they're out of the water and sunny. They're very shiny and purple right here, but in the water they're very shiny and more of an olive green color when they're healthy and running around the water there. I always put the scientific name when I'm talking about. It's always a mouthful. I put it here so you guys can go back and look it up. A lot of times when you Google the scientific name, you're going to find a lot more accurate things on the subject matter. As in this case, you get a lot of the opinion stuff kind of set aside, and you get more scientific documentation. Okay, about the blueback herring. Let's first go into the biology of it. This is something that typically lives up to 8 years, can grow up to 16 inches. You typically don't see that in freshwater. I just don't think they live long enough. The bigger they get, the easier target they are, and they just get eaten, especially with these stripers around. Most of what you see around here is going to be 3 to 5 inches, and it'll grow about 4 or 5 years old. They reach maturity about 3 years old and start reproducing at that point. Just went over that. You'll see that the bigger sizes are typically saltwater versions. They'll typically spawn April to May. A lot of what I'm going to say here don't take as definitive. There's always a range. Last year, much of this came later. This year, much of it came earlier. So, it can be February to April. Some years it could be, May to June. So just kind of take that in a reference, but typically is the heat of it, right in the middle of it is April to May, and that's 69 to 75 degrees. If things are optimal, full moon, clear nights, warm and trend, you could see them spawning as early as 65, but this is optimal. If you put your boat in the water and you're seeing 69 degrees, odds are, if you're a full moon, April, May, you got some blueback herring spawning. These guys, they're predominantly open water feeders. You hear me talk about microscopic organisms called zooplankton. The zoo means animal-like, plankton means microscopic organism. So you'll have phytoplankton, which is a plant-like microscopic organism. But in this case, they like eating the microscopic animals. They do feed on other things. They will feed on, we'll get into this later, but they will feed on larvae of other fish that have hatched, as well as eggs at times. They're just growing machines. They'll just eat what they can and keep on going. That's the down of it. But they occur naturally in the Atlantic Ocean, and they swim into freshwater rivers to spawn. This is in their natural environment. I do have a picture right here if you want to see this kind of neat. You'll see the yellow. This is where they occur naturally, with them migrating up these rivers to spawn, and then you'll see these little areas of brown where they've been stocked. You've got a little bit of Lewis Smith here. You've got Lanier up in here, the Hartwell chain, Murray, Norman. All right, the behavior of blueback herring. They're very nomadic. They're opposite of gizzards and threadfin. Typically, gizzards and threadfin, when it's cloudy, they like to ball up and come to the surface. They're the opposite. They like to ball up and come to the surface when it's sunny, and they'll typically go down and scatter when it's cloudy. So that's kind of the big thing that when I guide people when they come to blueback herring lakes, they have a hard time kind of grasping their head around. But one thing too, I'll point out here in a second, they reproduce more than typical shad, so they will produce over several months. So like I was saying before, the heat of it's April and May, but you will have them going anywhere from March all the way up to June, July. Sometimes they'll reproduce several times a month. So they're reproducing quite a bit. I think I read somewhere, don't quote me on this, somewhere like 60,000 eggs. So they got a lot. They're relatively easier to catch for predators. As you see in that picture, they're pretty fragile looking. They dart a lot, but they're not very bony, not very rigid. They're not as good as escape artists. They just reproduce a lot, they eat a lot, they grow a lot, and they get ate. So that's why the plus side with blueback herring, as far as something that really kicks off the food chain for your stripers, if you're a striper fisherman or a bass fisherman, largemouth or spotted bass is what I'm referencing. They really do kickstart the food chain. The concern there, I mentioned before, is the eating of the eggs. If you don't have an established good population of bass before introduction, it's really hard at times in some of these lakes for the bass populations to catch up if the blueback population get ahead of them. That's why you have the stocking of stripers. There's a lot of people that ask my opinion that say, why don't you just keep just keep the stripers out of the whole equation. The nature of that is largemouth and spotted bass, they like to kind of sit in that upper water column, that 20 to 25 foot range, and that's just their personality. And if you get bluebacks out there in the open and are able to survive and grow without getting beat back, that's just what happens. They'll just get out of control. So these places, that's why they do stock stripers, because they do need to have those populations beat down during those summer months, specifically when they're just not being eaten on by bass. And at times, yes, they do compete, the stripers and bass, but they do need something to keep them in check during the summer months. And that's why they do stock stripers in these plays. I get that question a lot. So they just can't quit stocking striper. If they did, it would be pretty detrimental. A lot of people don't understand that. So how do they influence bass? Well, we just touched on it. The bass themselves will start to become nomadic. They'll tend to be more aggressive and position closer to the surface when it's sunny. Typical lake, when it's cloudy, that's when you pick up a topwater and you start going down the bank. In this case, on Murray, you pick up a topwater and you start fishing over points. They tend to like to live more out than in. But when they come to the surface, those fish will position. Typically, if what I tell people, let's say the water clarity is 6 foot, and that's very important. Maybe I should have put it in here, but let's say the water clarity is 6 foot. What I pretty much go off of is a fish's vision is better than ours. So if we can see 6, he can probably see 10. And what they'll tend to do is they'll be on a hump where they'll sit above a brush pile to where they can see both the surface and structure, whether it's a rock pile or a brush pile, whatever it may be. So if it's just a rock pile and they can see 10 foot down and 10 foot up, they're going to position in 20 foot of water. So that's kind of my formulation. So whatever your clarity is that you can see, kind of multiply that times 3. It's kind of a quick, easy number. So if it's 6 foot clarity, you'd be looking at 18 foot of water. If it's only, 4 foot clarity, they're probably closer to 12. So that's the reasoning behind it. Now, what will throw a curveball is what a lot of people do is they'll set brush or what they call cane piles, and they'll set them out there in 30 foot of water. What that does is allow the fish to sit on something higher in the column, but further out, deeper. And you will catch fish topwater over 30, 40 foot of water if there's something there that's still with the top of it peeking out within that, times 3 multiplier. So if they're sitting in that 18 foot range, but there's something that's in 30, 40 foot, where the top of it is right there on 18, 20 foot, you will catch topwater fish over that. So a lot of people get creative and do that, and it's pretty impressive to throw topwater over 30, 40 foot and catch a big fish if you've never done that before. Blueback herring is a huge prey preference. They're kind of just dumb roamers. They're not really like I touched on before, like shad and gizzard tend to be more sporadic. Like they want to take off. They're kind of a little harder to catch, a little bonier, a little harder to choke down at times. Gizzards can get really big real fast if they don't get eaten before a certain size. Blueback herring, they grow quickly to that 4 to 5 inch range in freshwater, and they tend to kind of slow down. Like I said before, the bigger ones tend to exist in saltwater. I'm going to touch on this again. The fish movements in saltwater, they tend to live in open water most of the year. You hear this with salmon. Salmon kind of complete their whole life cycle. Like they won't come in and spawn until they're ready to die. Herring aren't quite like that, but there is a pretty high death rate with blueback herring when they go in, and I'll touch on this too. This does play a big role when you're looking at freshwater lakes. Is blueback herring cannot and will not survive in what I call sedimentary water, really tannic water or muddy water. That's why you just don't see them surviving very well at Santee Cooper or places like Lake Wiley or even Watery here in South Carolina. And there's a lot of other places, I hear like a Coney and Sinclair, where they just won't survive. People, you're not supposed to, it's illegal. You're not supposed to transport them and put them in there, but they try and the reason they don't survive is because the water quality is there, but the water clarity is not. And so that's something to consider. So they live in open water mostly. They position along the rip currents out in open water, and they just feed on zooplankton. They're just out there with the whales, I guess. But they will migrate to spawn. I put March to May. They'll start to migrate, February to March, and move into those rivers and start their spawning process between there and May. And that's where I touched on before. A lot of their spawning has to take place in at least a brackish or fresh water. And with the runoff in the springtime of the year, a lot of times they just get intercepted by dirty water and that kills them. So there will be many die during the spawn cycle. That's pretty normal with blueback herring in saltwater environments. The way that differs in freshwater environments is their movements. They do live in open water during the summer months, but they prefer those riptides. It's just whether it's genetic programming or the fact that this all shad in general, like the current, they tend to move shallower in the winter months. And again, this is what I touched on before with gizzards and threadfins. A lot of situations they'll move deep. They'll get in the ditch in 20 foot of water. With herring, they'll get shallow. I mean, it could be really, really cold, and they'll be up in a foot, 2 foot of water, and you'll see bass blowing up in 45-degree water in the back of a ditch. And you won't understand why that is. Well, it's because blueback herring I think they're half crazy. But they're getting up there because they like that clean water. In the winter months, towards especially the fall, the early winter, it typically runs clean and runs clear, and they just get up in it. A lot of good zooplankton activity, and they're just looking for a meal. They have eggs already starting to develop, so that's what they're really concerned about, trying to get those eggs developed to start laying them there in the spring. They cannot, I touched on this before, they cannot live in sedimentary water. It will kill them. I don't understand the dynamic of that. Whenever I've seen that in the past, with a lake herring, it was one of the studies we dealt with. They has to do with their oxygen requirement, possibly getting on their gills. You see that with stripers, where they always got to keep moving, always got to keep a high oxygen level. So that might be a lot to do with it. But at any rate, when you get into dirtier water, you're not going to see herring. You'll see the gizzards and the threadfin. They'll migrate out of the creeks and the rivers to the mouths around March through May. What I tell people is, that's a baseline. That's not an absolute. So when you have a lot of your spring rains, will depict that. So if you have spring rains come early, say January, and you got a water line that's pushing them out, you're going to want to follow that color change. Color change is pretty important anyway. It becomes even more important on blueback herring driven lakes. So you'll see that if you ever want to go to blueback herring lake, go in February or March when you got a lot of good color change and a lot of good runoff, a lot of good rain. That's the time to go. They'll really group up, and you'll have a lot of striper, a lot of bass grouped in those areas. That's just a really fun time to go. Again, many will die during the spawn cycle in freshwater just through predation. They just get hammered on those flat points. And again, if you've never been on a good shad spawn with herring, you need to do it. May, June, about the latest. Typically April and May, around the full moons, and the first couple of spawns they will come up on the new moons. But it's just absolutely fun. They'll just hammer in about 2 foot of water. But them bass just absolutely choke them. So in this situation, with saltwater, it's a lot of it because of sedimentary reasons they get killed. Well, in freshwater, they can get away with it, but they still get hammered because they're locked into one place. They can't really get away from the fish. Again, the freshwater controversy with blueback herring is exactly that. They compete with the end of the year on the zooplankton. They're just eating machines, and also they'll actually eat the fry. Many times, your bass will hatch, your panfish will hatch slightly before the shad go to spawn, and they'll go eat on them before they actually go to spawn themselves. So that's important. That's why striper's your friend in these lakes. You've got to have striped bass. A lot of people say they don't want them there. You know, they think that the bass population would get better without the striped bass, but it wouldn't. In the long run, it just hurt them. Touched on that. Touched on that too. So I'm gonna throw out an analogy here, and I'm gonna go ahead and bring all three of these up so you can kind of see them. I compare this almost to people. You know, there's three personalities of fish anywhere you go. Maybe you haven't heard this analogy, but there's river resident fish, there's nomadic fish, and there's lake fish. And I almost compare the river fish to the country folk. You know, most of them are little old ladies that work out in the field, or you know, cook meals, or the kids run around, and every now and then you find Bubba. And that's kind of how river resident fish are. You have a bunch of 2-pounders, and every now and then you catch a 7-pounder. And I don't really know why that is. You see it in Florida, and you'll see a lot of that, you know, in the spring, a lot of 2-pounders, and then a great big one. And I think it's just because when you get in that, you know, 3 to 5-pound class, they're just, I don't know, adolescent teenagers. They're just on the go, and they just become nomadic. That's the only conclusion I have drawn from it, is that either the young ones are just too young to know kind of the program, and the old ones are just too old to want to do it. You know, they're just, you know, they're retired, I guess. You do have the nomadics where, you know, the populations become exaggerated with blueback herring. These are the guys that really benefit. These are your suburbanites. They live in the country, but they work in the city, and they sit in a car, they eat fast food, and you know, they're all a little overweight, but they're all doing really well, and they're all those, you know, 3 to 4.5, 5-pound class. I'm not saying you couldn't catch a 7-pounder in this group, but you typically see a ceiling around 5 pounds, 5.5 pounds. I can count, you know, less than 10 fish that I caught really over 6 pounds running those schooling fish. But they do, in many cases on blueback herring, that they win most of your tournaments. And then you have your lake fish. These are what I compare to your city folk. If you go to Chicago or New York, these are people that have to run around all the time. And these fish, they don't ever see any shallower than 8 foot. They spawn deep because they live in clear water. They live deep, and they have to spend a lot of energy chasing down food and eating. And the lake fish just stay in the lake, the river fish stay in the lake, and the nomadic fish just run the lake. So I'll show you that. So this Lake Murray, if you've never heard of it, it's right outside Columbia, South Carolina, which is right about in the center of the state of South Carolina. It's right there on the Saluda River, which will eventually flow into Santee Cooper. So I'm going to touch base on the winter time. Hopefully y'all can see this real well. I will start in the winter. I highlighted or circled here or squared off places that are known places during the winter. These are where the herring just winter up. If you catch a bass and he's coughing up something, he's going to cough up herring. And these are the areas typically they will be during the winter. Now, I'm going to clarify something. This is going to get maybe more confusing before it becomes clarity, but it'll clear it up here at the end. We're ignoring the lake fish and the resident fish at this moment. Right now, we're just focusing on where these fish set up, these nomadic fish set up in the winter. So again, these are the places. Most of them are towards the back third, either back third up the river or back third in the backs of the creeks. After the winter, when they start moving to the spring, now these aren't, again, definitives. These are an ever-evolving movement. This could happen early spring. It could happen late spring. So you got to really pay attention to things like I suggest, the striper boats, the birds, the color change. There was a tournament, I finished third in the Southern Open on Lewis Smith Lake. The pure reason why I did well in that tournament is I just drove the lake until I seen the striper boats and the birds. I had no idea what to do. I knew it was early in the spring. I knew there had been some rain, and I knew that there should be a section of the lake I should stay in. Again, that's not a definitive as far as getting on fish in a tournament, but if you're looking and targeting nomadic fish, this is where you want to go. I'll clarify that here in a minute. They're not always a definitive. There is a time and place to target these. So in the spring, you're going to see a lot of times they'll pull out to the middle section of these creeks. Much of that, in my opinion, is influenced by the runoff, by the rain. You know, they're just staying ahead of the color change. You're going to have your summer. This kind of is a continuation of the spring. Naturally, the places they are in the spring and the places they are in the summer, the bass are following them, but these places are where they shad spawn. You typically won't see one shad spawn up the river like you would a gizzard shad or a threadfin. If you wanted to run a shad spawn, you know, gizzard shad or threadfin shad up the river, you could easily do that. If you wanted to target herring, you're not going to see them up there for the reason of the water clarity. So these are the typical places you're going to start seeing them show up. They just simply move down, and a lot of these fish will come out kind of open water. You're going to have more current during the summer. There's a lot of lack of current after the spring rain stop because they're letting these lakes fill up. But once they reach capacity and they start maintaining them, you're going to start seeing these fish position around the bottlenecks of the lake. So this is pretty wide right here, and this bottom third, and then bottlenecks down right here in front of the dam. You're going to start having more current. This big section right here, not so much, but then these smaller bottlenecks are all high current places, and you can follow the main channel here. This is on just the Navionics right here on their web app. And all these are these bottlenecks, like this S-curve in the river right here. This is Buffalo Creek and Rocky Creek. All these are bottlenecks, and again, it becomes a track record. Kind of where they settled out is kind of where they're going to hang out for the summer. In the fall, you're going to see a lot of mirror image of the spring. The difference is, again, it's not as definitive. By the end of the summer, you got a lot of algae blooms and zooplankton populations increasing, but for the most part, the lake is settled out, and the populations of the herring have started to disperse. This is a time of year that if you do see a fish kill on a blueback herring driven lake, it's usually at this time of the year. We had one last year on Murray. We've had it before. I want to say it was in about 2010, almost for the same reasons, where you had a big spring rain and it concentrated all your bait fish, you know, in this midsection early. And those stripers, they just had all you can eat buffet hitting them in the bass. And so those, by the time they migrated down here by the dam, and you got into the fall and the lake settled, the populations of the herring was so low. By the time the herring started migrating back up the lake, they just ran out of food. Match that with low oxygen levels, what I call oxygen saturation. You just have a lot of other stuff from the summer, and you know, plankton cycles. You get a lot of other stuff in the water that just makes it hard for the striper to breathe. They're already stressed out, and you will see a kill. If you see a striper die off, it's nothing to be alarmed about. It doesn't mean that, you know, the whole lake is in trouble. It's just actually a normal process, especially if you have a big spring rain, big heavy rain in the spring. Typically, you're going to see something happen in the fall with just the populations be thinned out. So fortunately, they bounce back quickly, and the stocking programs bounce back quickly. So this is where I'm going to clarify it. This looks like a mess. If you look at the green, I'm going to identify these areas as areas that you're going to see resident fish live. All these areas have one thing in common. There's some sort of flow coming in that they can sustain life. They just don't leave the areas. They like those areas, whether, again, it's just resident spawning grounds that eventually join up with nomadic fish, or their retirement communities for the older nomadic fish, whatever you want to call it. But these are resident fish on Lake Murray. The purple would be the opposite end of the spectrum. These are lake fish. Now these two places, the purple, you can see the purple here, I don't know if that's showing up, as well as the green, you can catch fish on year round, absolutely year round. If you wanted to go out there and drop shot and catch fish off in 40 foot of water on a brush pile, you're going to find them, and they live there year round. What I find is a 15-pound bag is a pretty good bag doing that. Same thing on your resident fish. You catch 15-pound bag, it's probably got a bunch of 2-pounders in one great big one. If you catch 15-pound bag, down in the lower end, you got quite a few 2.5-pounders, and you might have got a 4. But this range here, all these little systems of these where I've marked it in red, that's where your nomadic fish will kind of move in and out or settle up. Especially here in the river, it could be quite a big zone. The key is knowing where they overlap with a certain personality. So where you have two like personalities, where you have nomadic fish and lake fish cohabitating, that's where you want to target. If you have nomadic fish and resident fish cohabitating, that's where you want to target. That's just where the majority of the fish are. That's not to say you couldn't still, go catch, fish deep, and you may want to, if things are just trashed, if big rain and the fish are on the move and scattered, may not be good. So just hopefully that didn't confuse you more than help you. But you have 3 moving wheels in motion here. And to understand that there are 3 personalities of fish and why you can go to one in the lake and catch them one day and then the other in the lake and catch them the other day, that's why. You just need to know why that is and when that is. So I'm going to get into that here to kind of summarize. Your river resident fish, they tend to get more excited when nomadic fish are around, and or when the nomadic fish and the lake fish are scattered. That's usually, like I mentioned before, you get a lot of cloudy conditions, either during the winter months or the summer months is usually when your resident fish tend to be best. You're not going to get beat by somebody fishing brush piles where the fish are grouping up, or fishing topwater bite, or the fish are, hammering the surface and they're just positioned. When they get positioned in that open water is when they get aggressive, because there's just more fish there. I use the analogy that, if you have, a bunch of pit bulls in a room, not that pit bull should get a bad name, just an example. If you throw a ham bone down a hallway with a bunch of pit bulls, they're going to fight over it, even if they just ate. But if you have one by himself that just ate, same ham bone situation, he's not going to be in the mood to chase it down. So you need, even if they're full, you need some grouping going on. And if you just can't find that, if you get in a situation, that's the example when nomadic fish aren't always the answer. So knowing when they're the answer is, when you need to target them. But river resident fish tend to do better when the crayfish are molting or when they're spawning. We went over that in another webinar, or even when the bluegill are spawning. Typically, bluegill or panfish or shellcracker, they'll typically want to reside in dirty, tannic water, more in backwater areas where simply, in most cases, not always the case, but in most cases, you just don't see cohabitation of bluegill with herring. You'll see bluegill and gizzard, bluegill and threadfin, but that's a situation where you can target river resident fish. Again, I probably should have put in, gizzard or threadfin. If you're getting a spawn or something like that, it could be beneficial. So you just got to understand those windows. It's not always a definitive. I've learned fishing here, you don't just say one weekend I found them here and I'm definitely going to do this the next weekend. They will move from day to day. So your nomadic fish are best when the bait and the bass are grouped up and typically on the move. If they're coming down the river or going up the river and you have that wide section of lake being constricting to forcing those fish into a smaller area, or the fish are coming down the lake and they're grouping up from the winter months and getting in front of that dirt, that color change. Those are 2 times when you can really get on those nomadic fish. The lake fish, again, they're best when the nomadic, river resident fish are scattered, usually multiple days of sunny conditions, when there's grouping, when they're forced to all cohabitate on a brush pile or a rock pile. But usually December, through February or June through August. The big thing is where blueback herring help a lake is they help nomadic fish bridge the gap between just resident and lake fish. You know, like I mentioned before, you have three personalities, I believe, in every lake or potential. You may have, you know, one lake just have, I don't know, like Lake Erie. There might not be a whole lot of resident fish. There might be nomadic fish and lake fish, but there are going to be, you know, I believe at least two of the three. Some lakes have all three, but in most cases, the nomadic fish aren't as prevalent as they are in blueback herring lakes, and that's where blueback herring are good for it, especially as your angling success, is they help bridge the gap. There's touched on that. I believe there's nomadic fish in every lake. I think that's an adolescent age class personality, and I think that's where you see a lot of those tournaments won on those fish. Touched on that. Lure selection. You know, what I've seen with these nomadic fish, it's pretty simple. During cloudy conditions in the summer, some sort of finesse and drop shot. The more scattered they are, the more you want to slow down. During the spring, summer, and fall, if you get a lot of sunny conditions, it's just everything high in the water column. Your hard swim baits, your soft, soft jerk baits, and even your top waters. I'm actually showed here a bait I designed for IMA, the IMA Glide Fluke. You know, that kind of plays on hard swim baits and soft jerk baits, bridges the gap between the two techniques. That's been real successful. Crankbaits, hard jerk baits, spinner baits, soft swim baits, you know, those are typically winter or spring when they're shallower. They're more accessible with those techniques. And then spoons all year. A lot of people think spoons are only a wintertime deal. There are so many times when the bass are feeding on young of the year thread herring that are just a couple inches long, and they will not eat a 5-inch or 4-inch bait, and they'll just jump over it and tumble over it. Have yourself a good spoon. There's different kinds of spoon. There's steel spoons, there's lead spoons, but the spoons I'm referring to are the little guys. You know, the 2-inch ones. You got spoons that you can bend, you know, create a kick. You got spoons that are just shaped a little different. You know, the Berry's Flex-It spoon is a good spoon. I like the Lure Jensen Crippled Herring is a good spoon. There's a lot of other ones out there. War Eagle makes a real good spoon. But with the colors, I like chrome. I was saying if it ain't chrome, leave it at home, especially on the herring lake. They like it when it's sunny. Anything that has any kind of foil. It doesn't have to be solid chrome. Sometimes on partly cloudy days, chrome is not good. But if it's just bright sunny like you see in that picture, chrome is pretty good. The more partly cloudy it is, the more I try to transition to kind of a chromey color, you know, chrome with some sort of color on it, to have some sort of separation. But the cloudier it gets, a bone color. So the same thing with the spoons. You know, kind of get creative. Use all chrome when it's sunny. Maybe a solid white when it's cloudy, and then maybe something in between, like a painted silver or something the other time of year. So there we go. That's the herring lake in a nutshell. It's pretty straightforward. But probably the biggest thing I can point out is just understanding that in a herring lake, a bass will move many, many miles, you know, 15 to 20 miles. I've watched a specific school show up there in the fall, late summer, fall, and I followed them literally 15 miles up the lake. And every day they move 1 point, and it's one of the biggest schools I've ever seen, all 3 to 5 pounders. This is about 3 years ago. And it amazed me that they would move that far. And I lost them once I got out to the split of the river. It was just that time of year where they weren't really schooling real well. And once I went up into the river, you know, I went so far up, I'm catching these solid dark fish, and they're just skinnier and longer. And then within a week or so, all of a sudden, all these big fat white fish that looked like little torpedoes showed up. And those are the fish that had migrated on up the lake. So a lot of these lakes, you know, you look at Toledo Bend or, you know, even these Tennessee River lakes, a lot of them will just use a specific zone well, they may only live a couple hundred yards their whole life. There's a book, trying to think of the guy's name, John. Anyway, it's called Tracking Trophies. I don't even know if it's even available anymore. It talks about this guy tracking these fish in Toledo Bend, and they only went a couple hundred yards in their whole life, in their whole yearly cycle between the spawn and what they did in the summer. But when you bring blueback herring into a mix, they will migrate the whole lake. They will use the whole lake. So again, I had a lot of people that came here, and then next week the fish are gone. Many times, on lakes like Toledo Bend or a non-herring lake, once they set up on a point, they're going to use that point. With herring fish, once they set up on a point, they're going to use that area. They're either going to move a couple points left or a couple points right. A lot of times it could be a wind direction. If the wind blows solid from one direction for too long, they can make major moves. They can move on the other side of the cove even, depending on how far it is, but they're not afraid just to roam open waters. But at this point, if there's any questions, here I got the chat. You guys can type in any questions. You have an opportunity here. Again, if not, you're more than welcome to send me a personal email or a Facebook message, and I'll be happy to respond that way. Any questions at all from anybody? Any? Here we go right here. I have one from John. He lives on Lake Moultrie. You got Moultrie Marion, so that's Santee Cooper, for all those who don't know. He found out by accident that the catfish targeting herring live on cut bait at times. When that happens, only herring produce results, and it's usually in the spring. What other predators do the herring have? That's a good point. Okay, so Merriam is an upper lake, which is pretty dirty. Moultrie is a lower lake of Santee Cooper, which is pretty clear. Those are actually probably migrant fish coming up the Cooper River. So yes, the catfish do target those. Anything that would target shad, I would say gar. Some people fish for gar. They catch a lot of gar with herring. Anything that would normally feed on some sort of shad, I'm trying to think outside the box here. At the top of my list, even smaller ones, big crappie. I've had a big crappie cough up herring, little herring. But anything that would feed on a shiner or a minnow, if it's big enough to eat it, would definitely eat it. So absolutely, any of those type of it's funny you mentioned that. Any of those type of exotic fish introduced to these places, they're highly preferred. I noticed that with my crayfish study in college, and even some of these food diet research. My crayfish study, tilapia and trout were their preference, and they're much more fatty of a fish. And I think when you look at herring, because they have a lot less of a bone structure, they're definitely more of a fattier fish, just from the way fish prefer that. So any more questions? Let's see here. Well, if I missed your question here, this is one of the first times using Zoom. Just shoot me a message, shoot me an email. But again, thank you for your time, and thank you for everything that you guys been patient and watching this. And again, if you guys have any questions, feel free to message me. If not, we'll see you at the next webinar. Thank you guys very much.